Yeah, today I'm going to talk about Supersite network principally. So if I can jump to the next slide, because Jim's told you all about me. Okay, so the Supersites are really there to address the key challenges that we see in air pollution science in the UK. They're designed to give a definitive state-of-the-art assessment of urban air quality in the UK. And this has been demonstrated recently with the recent US National Science Foundation funding, which is very, very similar to what we have here in the UK now. They're designed to underpin the wider UK research and innovation programme, including Quant, which Jim's just mentioned. And some of the specific challenges we're addressing are understanding the trends and the changing sources of NO2 as we change our vehicle fleet, identifying similar trends in ammonia emissions through the penetration of SCR vehicles, and any changes in farming practices. Looking at the changes in emissions to VOC precursors, and this is really, really important for ozone formation as we go forward. And looking at PM in a lot more detail, looking at the contributions of non-exhaust emissions, wood smoke, cooking, for example, as other urban sources. Next slide, please. So we've got 3 measurement sites, all in urban background locations, and they're centred on the 3 main UK conurbations. So we have London, Manchester and Birmingham. It's not only the size of the conurbations that's important, but also the fact that the local regulatory authorities are taking different approaches to emission abatement. So in London, you may argue we're a little bit ahead of the game with the ULEZ and the low emission zone that's been around for a number of years, but Birmingham and Manchester are rapidly catching up with their own approaches to clean air. Next slide, please. So here's what they look like. They were installed between 2018 and 2019. And we've all taken slightly different approaches depending on how much space we had, what existing infrastructure we had. So Birmingham updated an existing measurement facility they had. Manchester went big and got four shipping containers. In London, we had to take a more bespoke approach, and we've got 1 supersized shipping container up on stilts. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what is in them. Some of the things you might recognise, some are more high-end research instrumentation, and I can take some questions at the end on this. I'll try and give a rough overview now. If you're familiar with modern air pollution measurement, you'll recognise some of these. So the ozone analyzer is pretty much a standard ozone analyzer that you will find in most air quality monitoring sites that are background or rural locations. We've taken a more research-focused approach to measuring NO2 and NOx. So we have a direct measurement of NO2, and that's cavity attenuation phase shift. So that's a direct optically based assessment of NO2, laser-based. Our chemiluminescent box looks at NO and NOY rather than NOx. So this removes some of the uncertainties around the loss of some of the NOx species within the sampling system. For some of the greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, we have a cavity enhanced laser absorption instrument, and that also measures CO. We've got cavity enhanced laser absorption for ammonia, and then for the VOCs, the University of York have developed an improved cryogenic trap which extends the range of chemicals that you can look at. So typically an online VOC instrument would look at alkanes up to your aromatics, so C2 to about C12. But this instrument with its enhanced trapping can look at some of those lightweight oxygenated VOCs like methanol, ethanol and acetone, which are really important for the ozone formation. Next slide, please. For aerosols, we're really focused on PM2.5 mass, chemical composition and particle size distribution. So for mass, we're using the Pallas FEDAS, and that's given us principally PM2.5 and PM10 mass, and that's an optical based system. For black carbon, we've got the ethalometer, which is widely used not only around the UK but worldwide to measure black carbon. That can also tell us a lot about the sources of wood burning. As we get into the more advanced instrumentation, we have an aerosol chemical speciation monitor, which is a type of aerosol mass spectrometer. So this gives you your non-refractive PM2.5, which includes species like organic carbon, ammonium, nitrate, sulfate. So this tells us really the bulk of the chemical species that are in PM2.5 in the UK. Lots of these will come from primary sources and some of them will come from secondary sources as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we differentiate those later. One of the newest bits of instrumentation is the XRF instrument, so the X-ray fluorescence. We're using the exact 625. That measures 65 different elements. We've adapted this slightly. All these are expensive instruments, but we want to measure both PM10 and PM2.5. And of course, what you measure in terms of PM size depends on the inlet that you put on top of it. Although we're really interested in PM2.5 mass, lots of the components that the XRF is very good at measuring, so lots of the metals or mineral components are really prevalent in the coarser fraction. So it's important to understand their composition in PM10 as well as PM2.5. So we've developed a system that switches between PM10 and PM2.5 on an hourly basis. So if you imagine inside this instrument, there's a tape that rotates round every hour. So for every different spot, every different hour, we get either PM10 or PM2.5. And this allows us to assess both of them essentially for the price of one instrument. Moving on to particle size distribution, we have a scanning mobility particle sizer. Again, a fairly standard research instrument that tells you about the distribution of aerosols from around 10 nanometers up to just under a micron. And we're also measuring the total particle number concentration. So a little bit more simple, but this is much more, this gives you the total number concentration, and this has a CEN requirement as well. So much more linked to standardization. We're also collecting aerosols as well. So we're collecting PM10 and PM2.5 using high volume samplers so they can be analyzed later. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we intend to do with this data we're collecting. So one of the most interesting areas, certainly for me in terms of research, is being able to understand where the aerosols come from, where PM2.5 comes from. It comes from a wide range of sources. And of course, if you're only measuring PM2.5 mass, it's very difficult to understand whether it's going up because of local emissions or whether it's going up because we've got a lot of incoming transboundary PM2.5, say, from industry and agriculture on the continent. So by measuring all of these different components, and you can see that in the cartoons on the right-hand side, being released from different sources. The diagram on the bottom is really there designed to represent, if you see that the circle in the middle is a filter being made up of aerosols from different sources. I've then split this up into the different techniques and the different chemical components we're measuring to give you an idea of what the different instruments measure and allow us to split that PM2.5 apart. So by doing it in this way, we can understand where the different sources are, so where the total mass comes from. It can yield physically meaningful factors by inputting the data and the uncertainty. So we get factors that may represent long-range transport, they may represent cooking aerosols, they may represent brake wear or tyre wear, etc. And this, of course, once you start to disentangle the PM2.5, you can link those sources, or indeed those chemical compositions, more directly to health impacts. And then that would allow you in the future to develop a policy that is aimed to drive down perhaps the most toxic or most health relevant components of PM2.5, rather than aiming your policy at driving down PM2.5 in general. And that allows you to deliver a more effective and a more efficient policy. It can also be used to inform modelling, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And it's being used to support other SPF, that's other parts of the Clean Air Programme, such as APEX, which is a study looking at exposure. And of course, what we're doing at one site can be done at all of those background sites because we're using exactly the same techniques. So as we develop one particular methodology in London or in Manchester, it can be cross-applied to the other sites. So how are we doing this? We're measuring the bulk chemical composition and the size distribution, then we're applying these multivariate statistical analyses, things like positive matrix factorization or multilinear engine, to deliver these source apportionment outputs. We've done a lot of work in the last few years standardizing this approach through a European cost action called Colossal, and that means that not only in the UK but across Europe and to a certain extent across the world, we're not only measuring in the same way, but we're also undertaking the source apportionment in the same way. Next slide, please. So here's a very quick output of the sort of thing that we're delivering. So I've used cooking as an example here. Many people may not realize how important cooking is in an urban area and how it contributes to PM 2.5 concentrations. So on the bottom right hand side, we've got diurnal variability. So that's how cooking aerosol concentration varies through the day. And the bottom slide is how it varies on each day of the week. So you can see that at the weekend, Friday and Saturday night, in the evening, the contribution of cooking aerosol is a little bit larger. One of the ways that we can identify cooking from other aerosols is you can also see a clear lunchtime peak there. One of the main sources for this aerosol is the use of oils in frying. So this comes a lot from commercial cooking, like takeaway restaurants, etc. It is quite a dominant component in PM 2.5. It makes up about a third of the organic aerosol that we measure. And it's well recognised across many, many European and international studies. And one of the things we've been able to do with this output in London is to develop a cooking inventory based on the distribution of commercial cooking establishments across London. And that's what you can see on the top right-hand side. That's the cooking inventory for London. And you can see it's much more concentrated in the centre of London, where there are many more commercial cooking outlets than there are on the outside. Next slide, please. One of the other areas we're interested to explore is the role of traffic in PM 2.5 concentrations that we measure. Now, the supersites are based at background locations, and it's not always easy to pick up the influence of traffic at these locations. So it's very, very important to measure close to the road as well. Many people will be familiar with the Marylebone Road monitoring site, which is down on the bottom left-hand side. You can see that's very close to the road and very close to a busy road in central London. But Marylebone Road is in its own way unique, although we understand a lot about it, and indeed we've based a lot of what we understand about traffic emissions in the UK on measurements that have been made at Marylebone Road. There is, of course, a lot of variability. So we're trying to get out to more and more types of locations. So we have a trailer where we pack all of our high time resolution chemical composition measurements in, and then we take it on the road. And you can see two shots here. One is from a road in the middle of Manchester, so a little bit faster than Marylebone Road, but still an urban centre road. I managed to get a picture where there was just one motorbike going past. It was quite unusual. And the other one is in Salford, so also in Manchester, and this is right by Salford Hospital. And as you can see, we're just above a motorway there. So we're trying to capture a range of speeds, a range of fleet compositions as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're particularly interested in non-exhaust emissions. We know that non-exhaust emissions, or we estimate that they contribute 60% to PM 2.5 primary emissions and 73% to PM 10 primary emissions in the UK. However, these estimates are really highly uncertain. There aren't very many unique tracers for the sources of non-exhaust emissions. So non-exhaust emissions will be brake wear, tyre wear, and resuspension. But what we do know is their relative contribution is going to be changing. As we change the vehicle fleet, as EVs penetrate the vehicle fleet more, the direct exhaust emissions are going to be reducing. However, the weight of vehicles is increasing. Other complications are we're going to have regenerative braking, which is going to reduce brake emissions. The vehicle is going to be heavier, so perhaps braking will increase a bit, but tyre wear will also increase. So there's lots of changes, and we don't know enough now about the non-exhaust emissions. So understanding how they're going to change in the future is highly uncertain. So we need to do a lot more work in this area. Added to this, a recent Nature paper by Casper Dannenbach has shown that this source is directly linked to aerosol toxicity as measured using oxidative potential. I missed the last point on that. It's really worth adding that tar is also a really important source of microplastic pollution. Next slide. Well, what we found so far by looking at Maryland Road and Honoré Park, and what we do is we look at the background, we look at the roadside site, and then we take essentially the background concentration off of that to give us a roadside increment. We're also using CO2, again, the roadside increment, but linking that to the emissions of CO2 from vehicles, which we're fairly confident in the accuracy of. And that gives us what's called a dilution factor, and we can link our non-exhaust emission traces to CO2 emissions, and therefore get ourselves an estimate of emission factors for the vehicle fleet. So we did this actually over the period of lockdown. So we started before lockdown, earlier on in 2018, and through the lockdown period. And we got some really quite interesting results. First of all, we were able to generate emission factors, and by combining them with measurements of road surface, which we get from a sensor that's installed within the road, primarily to tell TfL when to salt the roads, but it tells us how much moisture is on the road. So it enabled us to understand what the emissions were like during different road conditions. And unsurprisingly, we found things like road resuspension was less when the road was wetter, but it allowed us to quantify it, and this has never been done before. We were also able to combine it with measurements of vehicle speed, which allow us to show and quantify the emission factors at different speeds. Next slide, please. One of the other things we found, and concentrating on lockdown, was that there were lots of changes to the vehicle speed and the number of vehicles going up and down Maryland Road. What we found was there was not really along the bottom you can see the effect. So in the kind of the dirty orangey mustard colour, you have to excuse me, I'm colourblind, is the pre-lockdown, and then in the purpley blue colour is the period of lockdown. And you can see that tyre wear and resuspension, which are the two on the left-hand side, centre and left-hand side, didn't change between pre-lockdown and during lockdown. Brake wear did. Now, there are two competing reasons for this. Firstly, the number of vehicles, well, three reasons really. The number of vehicles reduced, but their speed increased. But of course, if you think back to 2019, it was much, much drier as well. So we had probably a greater level of resuspension and re-emission of these non-exhaust emissions due to the drier weather than we would normally have, and that was kind of counteracting any reduction in vehicle flow. And you've also got vehicle speed, which increased as well. So lots of competing factors that we had to consider when we're assessing non-exhaust emissions, but even more so when you're assessing two different types or two different periods as well. So that just gives you a flavour of how much we can drill down into the different sources of PM2.5 and understand the processes of emission that are going on. And one final slide for me to touch on is just some of the other activity we're doing. We're linking with the STFC Air Quality Network. So we're utilising some of the things like ammonia emissions and linking them with satellite observations over the 3 supersites to understand how well satellites can be used to assess those spatially. We're linking with some of the other clean air program outputs like Quant and Apex. We're providing calibration facilities for things like Breathe London, but also for DSTL at Port and Down. They've come along recently and done some hazard chemical release testing. Not releasing hazard chemicals, but testing the sensors. And finally, we're linked closely with the Met Office and DEFRA, the Met Office to provide information for their forecasting. And you can see a dashboard on the right-hand side, which shows the high concentrations of pollutants or components of PM2.5 and where they come from during a long-range transboundary episode during spring 2018. And that's my last slide. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, David. As usual, very interesting talk. Um, I, I'm intrigued, and as we discussed earlier in the conference, that you're running both CAPS and uh, chemiluminescent analyzers. This came up earlier in terms of the artifacts associated with some of the conventional reference or reference equivalent measurements for gases. I think the same applies to particles, but we'll come to that in a moment. Can I ask what resolution, what time resolution are you running the supersites at? Are we looking at 15-minute, 1 hour data, 1 minute data? What?
We're running at 1 minute for
Good.
everything that will go down to 1 minute. So the gases,
Yeah.
most of the gases will go down to 1 minute, but many of the instruments cycle. So things like the VOC will sample for an hour and then analyze. Same as some of the other particular instruments.
Yeah, I think I welcome that decision. I think getting down to 1 minute, as was also discussed earlier in the conference, I think could be
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, especially when it comes to comparing the different methods of getting to the NO2 data. That's something that we're trying to do in Glasgow, and we should probably swap notes or connect you up with Rod and his team who are looking at it, but in a slightly different way. Um, the the PM 2.5, PM 10 switching that you described on the
Mm-hmm.
metals analyzer in particular, is the same situation being deployed at Birmingham and Manchester as well?
Yep, yep.
Super.
We redesigned and built these, so we've got these at all of the super sites.
Fantastic. That's going to yield some interesting information as well.
Yeah.
And my final question as chairman's prerogative would be, as I'm waiting for questions to come in on the chat, what about we had a really interesting session earlier today on small sensors and or whatever we want to call them, low cost sensors, lower cost sensors, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it strikes me that the richness of the information from the super sites uh, is actually presents an opportunity for co-location studies beyond what can be achieved in the AURN or other local authority sites. Is that something that you're also looking to use the super sites for, as to look at the difference between these new technologies and the accepted accuracy of the technologies that you're using?
Um, well, there's a few things already going on in that space. Quant is specifically working in that space already.
Yeah.
We've got a separate PhD as well that's looking at multiple sensors and looking at the impact of chemical composition and meteorological variables on how they perform compared to the reference measurements. So I think it's very much more focused on um, making making the sensors or giving the sensors a better chance of agreeing with the reference instruments.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And where they don't, perhaps understanding why, which is
Yeah, yeah.
something that we have to bear in mind. Um, the there's a question here: what happens to the historical data if we switch from CHEMI to CAPS for NO2? I guess that's a pretty wide question. You want to have a go at attempting to answer that one, David?
Well, the chemi is it's specified within CEN. It's a valid measurement for measuring NO2, and it reaches the required uncertainty limit values. In the same way, science advances, our ability to measure advances. You're not going to throw out all of the old data. You just have to take into consideration what relative effects it's going to have. Has it been influenced by nitric acid in its measurement? Depends what you're trying to do, really. Depending how you're going to treat the old data versus the new data. If we do
Yeah.
change to CAPS.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we can't let technological progress be held back by convention,
No.
but we do have to find a way to build bridges to the historical data from any improvements that we make in the future. Another question here: are you looking at ammonia data assimilation process for ammonia using a rather sparse ground network and satellite to give you a best estimate as described by Cirque and Ricardo earlier. I don't know whether you heard the presentations from Stuart and Amy earlier, but I get the gist of the question, I think, David.
I didn't, but that sounds very similar to the work that was done by my colleague Anna Fonts for the STFC pilot study, which really did it did assimilate the ground-based measurements from CEH and from the supersites and compared them to satellite observations.
Yeah, no,
So
that's
it
fine.
is an area we have worked in.